There is something watching your life right now, not observing it from a distance, not reviewing it in retrospect, watching it. This exact moment, the one where you clicked on a video with a title that made something in you go quiet. The one where a part of you already knows what is about to be said, even though your mind hasn't caught up yet. There is a presence that has witnessed every version of you, every attempt that dissolved before it became anything. Every door that opened for someone else while you were still standing in the hallway, hands full of everything you had to offer. Every night you lay still and ask the question you don't say out loud to anyone. Every morning you stood up anyway, not because you had certainty, but because something in you simply would not stay down. That presence has seen all of it, every single moment, without flinching, without turning away, without the story you tell yourself to make it bearable. And here is the thing almost no one tells you. That presence is not you. It never was. The one who has been watching your life unfold is not the one you've been calling yourself. The observer and the observed are not the same thing. They never were. And the moment you stop confusing the two, something in the architecture of your reality shifts so fundamentally that you cannot go back to seeing it the way you did before. This is not a metaphor. This is not a spiritual consolation. This is, at the most precise level we have available to us, the actual mechanics of how consciousness and reality interact. And we are going to look at it directly today, not around it, not in the comfortable abstract, directly. Because the thing you've been avoiding looking at is not the failure, it's not the disappointment, it's not even the fear. The thing you've been avoiding looking at is the one who has been watching all of it. Because the moment you see that clearly, the entire structure of what you've been calling your life reorganizes itself around a truth that is more powerful than anything you've been trying to manifest, attract, or build. You were never meant to look away from this, and today you don't. Let's begin with what you think you are. You have a name, you have a history, you have a particular arrangement of memories, preferences, fears, and ambitions that feels so consistent, so continuous, so unmistakably yours that you have never seriously questioned whether it is actually you. It feels like you. It sounds like you when it speaks inside your head. It worries the way you worry. It hopes the way you hope. It carries the specific weight of your specific disappointments in a way that feels completely personal, completely intimate, completely self. You call it, you have been calling it I for so long that the word feels like a fact. Not a label, not a construction. A fact. The most basic fact. The one that has to be true before anything else can be true. I am here, I am this, I am the one who has lived this particular life. But watch carefully, because here is where the observation begins. That I, the one speaking inside your head right now, the one nodding or resisting as these words land, the one that has an opinion about whether this is true, the one that is already preparing its counter-argument or its agreement, or its defensive armor. That I is a thought. It is a very sophisticated, very convincing, very continuous thought. But it is a thought. And here's the question that changes everything when you actually sit with it. Not as philosophy, not as a puzzle, but as a genuine act of looking. Who is watching that thought? Not who is having it. Who is watching it? Because if you can observe the thought that says, I, then you cannot be that thought. You are the one watching it. And that watcher, the one that is reading these words right now, the one that has been present through every version of the I you've inhabited over the years, the one that watched you be a child and watched you become whoever you are now, the one that is watching you watch yourself right now in this moment. That is not the I you've been defending, protecting, explaining, and trying to improve your whole life. That is something else entirely. Sit with that for a moment. Don't rush past what you just saw. If this is landing for you, if something in you just got quieter, take a second to like this video and subscribe so this kind of transmission keeps finding you. Here's what quantum mechanics tells us about observation. And I want you to hear this not as a metaphor, not as a loose analogy borrowed from physics to make a spiritual point feel more legitimate, but as a precise description of what happens at the most fundamental level of reality when something is observed. Before observation, a quantum particle does not exist in a fixed state. It exists as a probability field, a superposition of all possible states simultaneously. It is, in the most literal sense, every possible version of itself at once, not metaphorically, measurably. The mathematics of quantum mechanics describe a particle before measurement as a wave function, which is a mathematical representation of all the probabilities of where that particle might be, what state it might be in, what properties it might have. All of those possibilities are real. All of them exist simultaneously. None of them is more real than the others. Until observation occurs. The moment a measuring device, a detector, an observer, interacts with that particle, the wave function collapses. All of those simultaneous possibilities reduce to one. The particle is here, it has this spin, it has this energy. The act of observation does not reveal a pre-existing fact. It creates one. This is not interpretation, this is what the mathematics require. This is what every experiment since the double-slit experiment in the early 20th century has confirmed again and again in increasingly refined and undeniable ways. What you observe, you change, not because you're looking as powerful in some mystical sense, because at the quantum level, observation is not passive. Observation is an event, it is an interaction, it is a collapse of possibility into actuality. And reality, at its most fundamental level, does not exist in fixed form until it is observed. Now look closer. If this is true of particles, and it is measurably, demonstrably, reproducibly true of particles, then what is true of the observer? What is the nature of the thing doing the observing? Because here is what the physics does not explain, and what no one in the standard scientific conversation wants to sit with for too long because it leads somewhere uncomfortable. The observer in quantum mechanics is not the measuring device. The measuring device is just another set of particles. The observer is the consciousness that interprets the measurement. The observer is awareness itself. And here is where the physics and the deepest traditions of human self-inquiry arrive at exactly the same place from completely different directions. The observer is not a thing. The observer is not an object. The observer cannot be observed in the same way that an eye cannot see itself seeing. The observer is the pure awareness in which all observed things arise. It is not a person, it is not a personality, it is not the accumulated history of your choices and your failures and your moments of grace. It is the space in which all of that appears. You are not who you think you are, because who you think you are is something you can observe, and what you can observe is not the observer. This is not meant to make you feel erased. This is meant to make you feel free. Because the thing you've been defending your whole life, the identity you've been trying to protect and improve and justify and prove worthy, that construction is not you. It is something happening in you. It is something arising in the field of awareness that you actually are. And the moment you see that clearly, not as a concept, but as a direct recognition, the entire game changes. Let me show you something. There is a story about a man named Elias who spent 30 years building a wall. Not a physical wall. The kind of wall that is made from everything you've decided you are. Every conclusion you've drawn about your own worth from the outcomes that arrived or didn't arrive. Every story you've told yourself about why things went the way they went. Every identity you assembled from the rubble of your attempts. Elias built this wall stone by stone, year by year, and he was proud of it. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was solid. It was the most solid thing in his life. When everything else was uncertain, when the results didn't come, when the road refused to straighten, when other people moved forward while he rebuilt the same dream for the fourth time, the wall was there. Reliable, permanent, unmistakably his. He called the wall himself. One evening, a woman came to his door. Her name was Sable. She was old in the way that certain people are old. Not in years necessarily, but in the quality of their seeing. She looked at Elias the way someone looks at a painting when they are trying to understand not what it depicts, but why it was made. And after a long silence, she said something that Elias would spend the next decade trying to dismiss. She said, "Who is standing behind the wall?" Elias told her there was no one behind the wall. The wall was him. He had built it. He was it. Every stone was a piece of his experience, his history, his self. Sable nodded slowly. She said, "Yes." "But who watched you build it?" Elias opened his mouth to answer and found that he couldn't. Not because the question was confusing, because the question was suddenly devastatingly clear. Something had watched him place every stone. Something had been present through every decision, every disappointment, every moment of defiant reconstruction. Something had witnessed all of it without ever becoming any of it. And that something was not the wall. It was not the builder. It was not even the name he had given to the builder. It was the watching itself. Elias sat down, not because he was tired, because the ground felt different when he wasn't standing behind the wall, and what he felt in that moment was not the emptiness he had feared, not the dissolution of everything that mattered. What he felt was something so quiet and so vast that he had no word for it. Something that had always been there, something that had been watching him be afraid of losing himself for 30 years, knowing that the self he was protecting was never the real thing. The wall didn't disappear. But Elias stopped being it, and in that distinction, something in his life began to move in ways it hadn't moved in 30 years. And you have been building a wall too. Not because you are weak, because you are human. And this is what humans do when the world keeps measuring them and finding them insufficient. You assembled an identity from the evidence of your life, and then you became that identity. And then you spent enormous amounts of energy defending it, improving it, trying to make it worthy of the life you could feel you were meant to live. But the one who's been watching you do all of that, that's what we are here to look at today. Let's go deeper into what you're actually seeing. The identity you've been calling yourself is a construction. This is not an insult. This is a precise description. It is a construction assembled from memory, narrative, comparison, judgment, and the continuous story your mind tells about what it means to be you. The mind is extraordinarily good at this construction work. It is, in fact, its primary function. The mind takes the raw, uninterpreted flow of experience and converts it into a coherent story with a consistent protagonist. That protagonist is the I, the self, the person you introduce when someone asks who you are. And this construction is useful, extraordinarily useful. It allows you to navigate the world, to make decisions, to maintain relationships, to pursue goals across time. Without some version of a stable self-concept, the ordinary mechanics of human life become impossible. But here is what the construction cannot do. It cannot observe itself with complete clarity, because the observer and the observed cannot be identical. The eye cannot see itself seeing. The mind cannot stand outside itself to watch itself think. Every time the mind tries to observe itself, it is still using itself as the instrument of observation, which means every self-concept, every story about who you are, every conclusion you've drawn about your own worth and capacity and potential is a story told by the thing being evaluated, using the very faculties being evaluated to a judge who is also the defendant. This is why the self-improvement project is so exhausting. This is why no amount of achievement ever quite settles the question. This is why you can work harder than almost anyone you know, care more deeply than almost anyone you know, bring more genuine effort to your attempts than almost anyone you know, and still find yourself lying awake at night with that dense, invisible weight in your chest that refuses to be resolved by any result. Because the self that is trying to improve and the self that is judging the improvement and the self that is experiencing the exhaustion of the gap between them are all the same construction. And constructions cannot free themselves by working harder at being better constructions. The only thing that can see the construction clearly enough to free you from it is the observer. The awareness that is not the construction, the watching that precedes and outlasts every version of the self you've ever been. Look closer. Here's what the observer is not. The observer is not detachment. It is not the cold distance of someone who has decided not to care. It is not the absence of feeling or the suppression of experience. It is not the spiritual bypass of someone who has decided that nothing matters because nothing is real. The observer is not removed from life. The observer is the most intimate possible relationship with life, because it is present with every single aspect of it without flinching, without turning away, without the protective narration that the constructed self uses to make experience bearable. The constructed self says, "This is happening to me, and it means this about me, and it feels this way, and this is what I need to do to make it stop or make it continue." The observer simply sees, not coldly, not without compassion, but without the layer of story that converts raw experience into evidence for or against the self. And here's the paradox that changes everything. The moment you stop running the experience through the story of who you are, the experience itself becomes more vivid, not less, more real, not less, more yours, not less. Because you are no longer experiencing the story about the experience. You are experiencing the experience itself, and that direct contact with reality, unmediated by the construction, is what the quantum observer does when it collapses the wave function. It makes contact. It doesn't interpret from a distance. It touches, and what it touches becomes real in a way that interpretation can never achieve. This is where the quantum mechanics and the deepest human psychology arrive at the same truth. Reality is not fixed and waiting for you to navigate it correctly. Reality is the field of possibility that responds to the quality and clarity of your observation. Not your belief, not your positive thinking, not your carefully curated vision board. Your observation. The clear, direct, undefended seeing of what is actually here. And the most powerful observation you can make is the one you've been avoiding most carefully. The observation of the observer itself. Pause here. This is not a thought exercise. This is an observation. If you are willing, close your eyes for a moment, not to escape what's here, to see it more clearly, and notice the thoughts that are present right now. Don't analyze them. Don't judge them. Don't try to change them. Just notice that they are there. Notice that they are moving. Notice that they are not still. They are not permanent. They are not fixed. They arise and they pass. They appear and they dissolve. They have texture and momentum and direction. Watch them the way you would watch clouds moving across a sky. Not attached, not detached, simply watching. Now notice something. Notice that you are watching. Notice that there is a watching happening. Notice that the thoughts are moving and the watching is still. The thoughts are changing and the watching is not changing. The thoughts are many and the watching is one. Everything being watched is impermanent. The watching itself has no beginning and no end in your direct experience of it. Now ask yourself gently, without forcing an answer, without needing one. Who is watching? Not what is watching. Who? And notice what happens when you look for the watcher. Notice that the watcher cannot be found as an object. It cannot be located. It cannot be pinned down. Every time you try to find the watcher, you find only more things being watched. And yet the watching continues. Undeniable, immediate, present. That is what you are, not the thoughts, not the story, not the identity constructed from the history of your attempts, the watching itself, the awareness in which all of that appears. Open your eyes when you're ready. Here's the layer underneath that. The reason this recognition is so difficult is not intellectual. You understood the concept immediately. You probably understood it before I finished explaining it. The reason it is difficult is that the constructed self, the identity you've been calling I, does not want to be seen through, not because it is malicious, because its entire existence depends on being taken seriously as the real thing. The moment you see it as a construction, it loses the authority it has been exercising over your life. And it has been exercising a great deal of authority. Watch what that authority has been doing every time you didn't take the risk. The constructed self had a reason. A very reasonable, very coherent, very you-sounding reason. Every time you stayed in something that wasn't serving you, the constructed self had an explanation. Every time you diminished yourself to fit into a smaller space than you were meant to occupy, the constructed self had a story about why that was the wise thing to do, the safe thing to do, the only realistic thing to do. Every time you felt the weight in your chest late at night, the constructed self had an interpretation. This is what failure feels like. This is what not being enough feels like. This is what happens to people like you. And here is the cruelest part of the construction, the most devastating piece of its authority. It sounds like you. It speaks in your voice. It uses your memories as its evidence. It knows exactly which arguments will be most convincing to you because it is made of you. It is assembled from your most intimate experiences. And so when it tells you who you are and what you're worth and what is and isn't possible for you, it feels like the truth. It feels like self-knowledge. It feels like honesty. But it is not the observer. It is the observed. It is not the awareness. It is the content of awareness. And content, no matter how convincing, no matter how intimate, no matter how continuous, is not the same as the consciousness in which it appears. The moment you see this, really see it, not as a concept, but as a direct recognition of what is actually happening in your own experience. The authority of the construction begins to dissolve, not because you fight it, not because you replace it with a better story, because you stop taking it as the final word on what is real. You begin to watch it instead of being it. And what you watch, you change. What specific story did you just recognize running underneath everything? Drop it in the comments, not the whole history, just the one sentence it has been telling you about who you are. Name it here and watch what naming it does to its authority. Let me show you something else. There is a woman named Mira, who was extraordinarily good at suffering, not in a dramatic way, in the quiet, practiced way of someone who has refined their suffering over decades until it runs almost automatically, almost invisibly, almost indistinguishably from just being alive. Mira had a story about herself that she had been carrying for so long it had become structural. It was in the way she entered rooms. It was in the way she spoke about her work. It was in the particular quality of her hesitation at the exact moment when something good was about to happen. The almost imperceptible pulling back. The subtle self-sabotage so practiced it no longer felt like a choice. The story was, I'm the kind of person things don't quite work out for. She didn't say this out loud. She would have denied it if you asked her. She had read the books. She knew the language of growth and possibility and deserving good things. But underneath all of that, running like a current beneath the surface of every attempt was this story. And the story was so old and so familiar and so completely woven into the fabric of what she called herself that she couldn't see it. She was too close to it. She was it. One day, Mira did something she had never done before. She sat down with no agenda, no practice, no goal, and she simply watched herself. Not to fix herself. Not to understand herself, not to catch herself doing something wrong so she could correct it. She just watched, the way the observer watches, without interpretation. And what she saw astonished her. She saw the story running. She saw it the way you see a film playing when you step back from the screen far enough to see the projector. She saw the thought, things don't work out for me arising, and then she saw her body responding to that thought as though it were a fact, as though it were the weather, as though it were the ground itself. She saw herself making decisions from inside that story without ever questioning whether the story was real. She saw years of her life organized around a narrative she had never chosen, never examined, never consented to. A narrative assembled from a handful of painful experiences in her earliest years, conclusions drawn by a child who didn't have the capacity to draw more accurate ones and then carried forward as unquestioned truth for decades. And in the moment of seeing it, something happened that Mira had not expected. She didn't feel devastated. She didn't feel angry. She didn't feel the need to immediately dismantle the story and replace it with a better one. She felt something she could only describe as relief. The relief of finally seeing something clearly after a very long time of looking away. the relief of the observer recognizing that it is not the thing it has been watching. The story didn't disappear immediately. Stories that old don't vanish in a moment. But it lost something critical in that moment of clear seeing. It lost the authority of being taken for reality. It became what it had always been, a thought, a narrative, a construction. And Mira, for the first time, was the one watching it rather than the one being it. And you have a story running too. You already know what it is. You don't need me to name it because something in you just named it when I said that. The story that runs underneath everything. The one that sounds like you. The one that has been organizing your decisions and your hesitations and your particular quality of hope. The hope that is always slightly braced for disappointment for as long as you can remember. What would happen if you watched it instead of being it? Not if you fought it, not if you replaced it, if you simply watched it with the clarity of the observer, if you let it be a thought instead of a truth, if you let the awareness that you actually are see the construction for what it is. Here's what no one tells you about observation. Most people think that seeing something difficult will make it worse. That looking directly at the painful thing, the story, the pattern, the construction will intensify it. Make it more real, make it harder to bear. This is why avoidance feels like self-protection. This is why looking away feels like wisdom. If I don't look at it directly, maybe it won't fully solidify. Maybe it will pass. Maybe I can keep functioning without having to face it. But here's what actually happens at the quantum level when you observe something directly. The wave function collapses, the superposition resolves, the infinite possibilities reduce to one actual state. And that one actual state, as painful or uncomfortable or confronting as it might be, is infinitely more workable than the superposition of all possible painful states that you've been living in while avoiding the direct observation. When you don't look at the story directly, it doesn't stay vague and manageable. It expands. It fills the space of your avoidance with all its possible worst versions. The thing you won't look at becomes the thing that shapes everything because it has to operate from the shadow. It has to run the show from behind the curtain because you've decided the curtain stays closed, and it runs the show very effectively from there. More effectively than it ever could if you simply looked at it directly. Because direct observation collapses its power. Direct observation reveals it as a construction. And constructions, once seen as constructions, lose their authority over the observer. This is not belief. This is quantum mechanics. The observer effect is not a metaphor for the power of positive thinking. It is a description of what happens when awareness makes contact with possibility. The contact itself is the event. The seeing itself is the change. Not a step toward the change itself. This is why the most powerful thing you can do is not to manifest harder, not to believe more intensely, not to take more inspired action, though none of those things are wrong. The most powerful thing you can do is to see clearly, to bring the quality of the observer, the pure, undefended, unflinching awareness that you actually are, into direct contact with the thing you've been running from. Because the moment you do, the thing you've been running from collapses from a probability field of all possible threats into one actual, specific, finite, workable reality. And actual, specific, finite, workable realities are not nearly as terrifying as the infinite probability field of the thing you refuse to look at. Look closer. Let's talk about what you've been refusing to look at. Not in the abstract, in the specific. You have been refusing to look at the possibility that the self you've been trying to improve is not the self that needs improving. You've been refusing to look at the possibility that the effort you've been putting into becoming a better version of the constructed identity is effort directed at the wrong thing. Not wasted, never wasted, because every step of the path brought you here to this moment of potential recognition, but misdirected, aimed at the construction rather than at the observer. Aimed at changing the content rather than recognizing the nature of the consciousness in which the content appears. You've been trying to build a better wall when the invitation, the one that has been waiting for you your entire life, is to meet the one who watches the wall being built. And here's what makes this so difficult. Here's the thing that almost no one who talks about awakening or self-realization or the observer state ever says clearly enough. Meeting the observer is not comfortable at first, because the observer doesn't have the story, the observer doesn't have the identity, the observer doesn't have the particular arrangement of memories and preferences and self-concepts that you've been using to know who you are and where you stand and what you're worth. The observer is naked in a way that the constructed self never is. It has no defenses because it needs none. It has no story because it is prior to story. It has no identity because it is the space in which identity appears. And that nakedness, that prior to story openness, feels at first like loss, like dissolution, like the terrifying emptiness of not knowing who you are. This is the moment most people turn back. This is the moment the constructed self reasserts itself with particular urgency, generating thoughts and feelings and memories that pull you back into the familiar territory of the story. Because from inside the story, the observer looks like nothing, and nothing feels like death to the constructed self. But look closer, because that nothing is not nothing, that spacious, story-free, identity-free awareness is not empty, it is full. It is full in a way that the constructed self, with all its content and history and narrative, never is. It is full of the actual, immediate, unmediated reality of this moment, which is more than the story has ever given you. The story gives you a filtered, interpreted, pre-categorized version of reality, organized around the protection of the constructed self. The observer gives you reality itself, and reality itself, met directly without the filter of the story, is not terrifying, it is extraordinary. Pause here again. This is not a thought exercise, this is an observation. Notice right now, in this moment, before any interpretation, before any story, before any judgment about what this means or what you should do with it. Notice that you are here. Not the story of you, not the history of you, not the future you're working toward or the past you're carrying. Simply here, this moment, this breath, this awareness. This is not a concept, this is your direct experience right now. Notice the quality of this moment when you stop adding the story to it. Notice that it is not empty. Notice that it is not threatening. Notice that it simply is. And you, the observer, simply are. Without needing to be anything other than this watching. Without needing to justify your presence here. Without needing the story to make you real. You are already real. The watching is already happening. The observer is already here. And now notice something extraordinary. Notice that this observer, this pure awareness that you are in this moment, has always been here. Through every version of the constructed self. through every story you've ever told about who you are, through every failure and every success and every moment of hope and every moment of despair. This watching has been continuous. This awareness has been present, not as a distant witness, but as the most intimate, most immediate, most undeniable aspect of your experience. You have never not been the observer. You have simply been so absorbed in what was being observed that you forgot you were the one watching. Open your eyes when you're ready, and let's go deeper. Here's the layer underneath that. The reason your life has felt the way it has felt, the weight in the chest late at night, the persistent sense that something is almost right but not quite, the exhaustion of the effort that never quite resolves into the certainty you're reaching for, is not because you haven't tried hard enough. It is not because you haven't believed enough. It is not because the universe has decided you are not worthy of the life you can feel you're meant to live. It is because you've been trying to resolve a question at the level of the constructed self that can only be resolved at the level of the observer. The question is, am I enough? And the constructed self cannot answer that question with any finality. It can only gather evidence. And evidence is always ambiguous. Evidence can always be interpreted in multiple ways. Evidence from the past can always be contradicted by evidence from the future, which means the question is never actually closed, never actually settled, never actually resolved. The constructed self will spend its entire existence gathering evidence for and against its own sufficiency and will never reach a conclusion because the question is not answerable at the level of the constructed self. But the observer doesn't ask that question. Not because it has decided the answer is yes, because the question doesn't arise at the level of the observer. The observer is not sufficient or insufficient. It is not worthy or unworthy. It is not a success or a failure. It is the awareness in which success and failure and worthiness and insufficiency all appear as temporary states of the constructed self. It is prior to the question. It is the space in which the question arises and passes. And from that space, the question loses its urgency, not because it has been answered, because it has been outgrown. This is what it means to find the observer, not to answer the question of whether you are enough, to recognize that you are the awareness in which that question appears, and that the awareness itself is not in question. The observer is not on trial. The observer is the witness, and the witness, by definition, is not what is being judged. Here's where this connects to your life in the most practical possible way. Every decision you've made from inside the constructed self has been, at some level, an attempt to answer the question. Every achievement was evidence for. Every failure was evidence against. Every relationship was a referendum. Every opportunity taken or avoided was a vote in the ongoing election of your own worthiness. And this is exhausting. Not because you're doing it wrong, because it is the nature of the constructed self to organize reality around the question of its own validity. That is what it does. That is what it has always done. That is what it will always do as long as you are identified with it as the thing you actually are. But the moment you shift identification from the constructed self to the observer, the entire structure of your decision-making changes, because you are no longer making decisions from inside the question. You are making decisions from the space that is prior to the question. You are making decisions from clarity rather than from the need to prove something. You are making decisions from the observer position, which is not detached from your life, but is present with it in a way that the constructed self, with all its defensive maneuvering, never quite manages to be. And here is what that changes. It changes the quality of your effort, not the quantity, the quality. Effort from inside the constructed self is always slightly contaminated by the need for the effort to prove something. The effort is never quite pure because it is always carrying the weight of the question, but effort from the observer position is clean. It is directed at the thing itself, not at what the thing will say about you. It is engaged with the work rather than with what the work means about your worthiness. And clean effort that is not carrying the weight of the question, moves differently in the world. It lands differently. It creates differently. It attracts differently. Not because the universe rewards purity of motivation in some moralistic sense, because clean effort that is not distorted by the need to prove something, is more precisely aligned with reality as it actually is, rather than reality as the constructed self needs it to be. This is not belief. This is the quantum mechanics of observation applied to the mechanics of a human life. Let's go deeper into what you're actually seeing. There is a concept in quantum mechanics called entanglement. When two particles interact and become entangled, they remain connected regardless of the distance between them. What happens to one instantaneously affects the other, not through any signal that travels through space, not through any mechanism that can be explained by classical physics, but through a connection that exists at the level of the quantum field prior to the separation of the particles into distinct objects. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance. He found it deeply uncomfortable because it violated his conviction that reality was local, that things only affected other things through direct contact, through signals that traveled through space at speeds no greater than light. But entanglement is real. It has been demonstrated. It has been measured. It has been used as the foundation for quantum computing and quantum cryptography. The universe is not local in the way Einstein wanted it to be. At the quantum level, separation is not the fundamental truth. Connection is. The appearance of separate, independent objects is a feature of the scale at which we observe, not a feature of the underlying reality. Now look closer, because here is what this means for the observer. The constructed self experiences itself as a separate, independent object. It experiences itself as bounded by the skin, located in a specific body, occupying a specific position in space and time, distinct from everything that is not it. This experience of separation is so convincing, so immediate, so apparently obvious that it forms the bedrock of the ordinary human experience of reality. I am here, the world is out there, I am separate from it. I act on it, it acts on me. We are distinct. But the observer, the pure awareness that you actually are, does not have this experience of separation, not because it has dissolved into some undifferentiated cosmic soup, but because awareness is not located. You cannot find awareness in your brain. You cannot point to the place where the watching is happening. Awareness is not in the body the way the liver is in the body. Awareness is the space in which the body appears, and space is not located within what appears in it. Space is the condition for the appearance of everything that appears. This means that the observer, the awareness that you actually are, is not separate from the quantum field in the way the constructed self appears to be. The observer is not a separate entity navigating a separate reality. The observer is, in the most precise sense available to us, an expression of the same awareness that is the ground of all reality. The same consciousness that is the observer of the wave function collapse is the observer that is watching these words right now. The same awareness that quantum mechanics requires in order for reality to be real is the awareness that has been present through every moment of your life. You are not a small, separate self trying to navigate a vast, indifferent universe. You are the awareness in which the universe appears. And that awareness, that observer, is not separate from the quantum field that is generating the reality you experience. It is, at the most fundamental level, the same thing. This is not philosophy. This is the logical conclusion of what quantum mechanics tells us about the relationship between observation and reality. And it changes everything about what you think you are and what you think is possible. Look closer. Here is the practical application of this. Here is where the quantum mechanics of observation meets the specific texture of your specific life. If you are not the constructed self, if you are the observer, then the constructed self is something that appears in your awareness. It is content. It is, like everything else in your experience, a temporary arising in the field of awareness that you actually are. The story, the identity, the particular arrangement of conclusions about your worth and your capacity and your potential, all of that is content. It is what appears. It is not what watches. And here's what this means for the weight in your chest. Here's what this means for the nights when the silence grows thick and the questions grow loud. Here is what this means for the years of effort that didn't resolve into the outcome you were reaching for. Those experiences are real. The effort was real. The disappointment was real. The weight was real. None of that is being dismissed or spiritually bypassed or reframed into something more comfortable. The observer doesn't do that. The observer sees clearly. And what it sees clearly is that all of those experiences, the effort and the disappointment and the weight and the resilience and the rising again, all of it is content. All of it is what appeared in the field of awareness you actually are. All of it is what the observer has been watching. And the observer watched all of it without flinching, without turning away, without the protective narration that the constructed self uses to make it bearable. The observer was present for every moment of it, fully present, completely present, without the distance of interpretation, without the buffer of the story. The observer has been with you in every moment of your life in a way that nothing else has been with you. More intimate than any relationship, more consistent than any achievement, more present than any moment of certainty you've ever felt. That is not a small thing. That is not a consolation prize. That is the most fundamental, most reliable, most undeniable truth of your existence. The observer has been here, always. The awareness has been present, always. And that presence, that watching, that pure awareness that you actually are, has not been diminished by a single one of the experiences the constructed self has been suffering over. Because the observer doesn't suffer, the observer witnesses, and witnessing is not the same as suffering. Suffering is what happens when the constructed self takes the content of experience personally, when it converts the raw flow of events into evidence for or against its own validity, when it runs the experience through the question and finds again that the question is unanswered. Witnessing is what happens when the observer is present with the experience without adding the story, without the question, without the need for the experience to mean something about whether you are enough. This is not detachment. This is the most intimate possible relationship with your own experience. Because you are no longer filtering it through the story, you are actually here with it. And being actually here with it, without the filter, is what allows it to move through you, rather than accumulating in you as that dense, invisible weight that you've been carrying for so long. Here's what that reveals. The weight is not the evidence of your failure. The weight is the evidence of your avoidance, not avoidance of the failure, avoidance of the observer, avoidance of the clear seeing that would reveal the construction for what it is. The weight is what accumulates when experience is not met by the observer, but is instead processed by the constructed self, which cannot actually process it. It can only add it to the story, and the story grows heavier with every addition, because the story was never designed to metabolize experience. It was designed to organize experience around the question of the constructed self's validity, and experience that has been organized around a question rather than met directly doesn't resolve. It accumulates. The observer metabolizes experience, not by analyzing it, by being present with it, by meeting it directly without the filter of the story, by watching it with the clarity that allows it to be what it is rather than what the constructed self needs it to be. An experience that is met directly, that is witnessed without interpretation, moves through. It completes itself. It doesn't accumulate. It arises, is witnessed, and passes. The way all content in awareness arises is witnessed and passes. This is why the observer is the most powerful position in the universe. Not because it controls, not because it forces, not because it manifests or attracts or creates through the sheer force of its wanting, but because it sees clearly. And clarity, the kind of clarity that comes from the observer meeting reality directly, without the filter of the constructed self, is the only force that transforms without resistance. Because it doesn't fight the thing it's transforming, it simply sees it. And what is seen clearly cannot maintain the authority of the unseen. The construction that is observed as a construction loses its power to organize your reality from behind the curtain. The story that is witnessed as a story loses its authority to determine what is and isn't possible for you. Let me tell you about a man named Kyle. Kyle was a builder. Not metaphorically, he built things with his hands, and he was good at it, extraordinarily good. He had a gift for seeing the structure of things, for understanding how forces move through materials, for knowing, before a single stone was laid, how the weight would be distributed, where the stress points would be, where the beauty could be found in the function. He built things that lasted, things that people came from far away to see. And yet Kyle spent most of his life believing he was a fraud. Not consciously. He would have told you he was confident in his work. He would have pointed to the buildings as evidence of his competence. But underneath the confidence, underneath the evidence, there was a story. A story that had been running since he was young enough to have assembled it from the most confusing kind of evidence. The evidence of being seen and then not seen, the evidence of mattering and then not mattering. The evidence that the things you build can be extraordinary and still not be enough to make you undeniable to the people whose recognition you most need. And so Kyle built, beautifully, relentlessly, with a quality of devotion that looked like passion but was, at its root, the desperate effort of the constructed self to finally build something so undeniable that the question would be answered. Am I enough? The buildings said yes. But the story said, wait for the next one. The next one will be the proof. There was never a next one that was the proof, because the proof was not in the buildings. The proof was never going to be in the buildings. The buildings were extraordinary. But the question was not a question about buildings. One day, Kyle was standing in the middle of something he had built, a large hall with a ceiling that caught the light in the early morning in a way that made everyone who saw it stop and go quiet. And he was standing there, and he was watching the light move across the stones he had placed with such care. And something happened that he could not explain and would spend years trying to describe. He stopped being Kale for a moment, not in a frightening way, in the way that happens sometimes when something is so beautiful that the self that is watching it dissolves into the watching. He stopped being the builder. He stopped being the question. He stopped being the story of the man who needed the next building to be the proof. And in that moment of pure observation, of being the watching rather than the watcher with a history and a question and a need, he saw the hall with a clarity he had never seen it with before. It was not more beautiful in that moment. It was real in a way it had never been real before. Because he was meeting it directly, without the filter of the story, without the question running underneath the seeing, just the hall, just the light, just the awareness meeting the reality of what had been built. And in that meeting, something resolved, not the question. The question dissolved, not because it was answered, because the one who had been asking it recognized for one clear moment that it was not the observer, it was the observed. It was content in the field of awareness. And the field of awareness, the observer, the pure watching that Kyle actually was, had no question about its own sufficiency. It simply was. Watching. Undeniable. Kyle went home that evening and sat with his wife, and she said he looked different, not happier exactly, clearer, like something had been resolved that she hadn't known was unresolved. He said, "I saw something today." She asked what. He said, "I saw who was building. And you have been building too, and you have been asking the question too, and the question has been running underneath every attempt, every effort, every moment of resilience, and every moment of despair. And the question will never be answered at the level of the constructed self, because the constructed self is the question. It is assembled from the question. It exists to ask the question and to gather evidence and to never quite reach the conclusion because the conclusion would make it unnecessary. But the observer doesn't have the question. The observer is prior to the question. And the moment you recognize yourself as the observer, the question doesn't get answered. It dissolves. And what is left, what has always been here underneath the question, is the clear, immediate, undeniable reality of the awareness you actually are, which has never been in question, which has never needed proof, which has been watching you seek proof for it your entire life with something that, if it could be described, would be described as infinite patience and absolute recognition. The observer has always known what you are. You are the observer. The question was always the construction. Now watch what happens when you hold this, not when you believe it, when you hold it. When you let it be present in your awareness the way the observer is present with everything in awareness. Without grasping, without defending, without needing it to immediately resolve everything that has been unresolved. Just holding it, just watching it, just letting the recognition be what it is. Notice what shifts in your body when you stop being the constructed self for a moment and simply are the watching. Notice the quality of the space that opens when the story takes a breath. Notice that the weight, that dense, invisible weight that has been your constant companion for so long, is not in the observer. The observer doesn't carry it. The observer watches it. And what is watched, what is met with the clear, undefended seeing of the observer, begins to move, begins to complete itself, begins to pass through rather than accumulate. This is the practice. Not a one-time recognition, a continuous returning, a continuous choosing to be the observer rather than the observed. Not because the constructed self is wrong or bad or needs to be eliminated, it doesn't. The constructed self is a useful tool, a remarkable tool. A tool that allows you to function in the world with continuity and intention and the ability to pursue goals across time. But it is a tool, not the user. And the moment you return to being the user, the moment you return to the observer position, the tool works better. Because it is no longer trying to be the thing it was never designed to be. It is no longer trying to answer the question it was never equipped to answer. It is simply doing what it does, navigating, planning, creating, building, while the observer, the actual you, is present with the reality of what is. This is where the quantum mechanics and the human psychology and the deepest wisdom traditions all arrive at the same place. The observer is the most powerful position, not because it controls reality, because it is the position from which reality is created. The wave function collapses in the presence of the observer. Possibility becomes actuality in the presence of clear seeing. And the clearest seeing available to any consciousness is the seeing of the observer who knows itself as the observer, who is not confused about what it is, who is not running the story of the constructed self through the lens of the question, but is simply present, simply watching, simply here. And here, from the observer position, is where reality responds. Not to your wanting, not to your effort, not to your belief, to your clarity, to the quality of your observation, to the presence of the awareness that you actually are, meeting the reality of what is without the filter, without the story, without the question. That contact, that direct meeting of awareness with reality, is what the quantum field responds to. That's what collapses the wave function of your life from all possible versions into the one that is most aligned with what you actually are, rather than what the constructed self has been trying to prove. You already see it. You just haven't admitted it to yourself yet. The reason you're here, the reason you clicked on this, the reason something in you went quiet when you read the title, is not because you needed to be introduced to a new idea. It's because something in you already knows this. Something in you has always known this. The observer has always been present. The awareness has always been here. The watching has been continuous. You have not been absent from your own life. You have been the most present thing in your life, the most consistent thing, the most undeniable thing. You have simply been so absorbed in what was being watched that you forgot you were the one watching. And the forgetting was not a failure. The forgetting was the journey of the awareness that forgot itself as awareness, that became absorbed in the content of its own experience, that identified with the construction rather than the observer, that spent years trying to improve the construction and prove the construction and defend the construction, and then in some moment of sufficient exhaustion or sufficient clarity or sufficient grace, began to look at the construction rather than from it, and in looking at it began to recognize itself as the one looking. This is the journey, not from ignorance to knowledge, from forgetting to recognition, from being absorbed in the content to recognizing the awareness in which the content appears. From the constructed self to the observer. From the question to the space that is prior to the question. And this recognition, this return to the observer, is not the end of your life. It is not the dissolution of everything that matters. It is the beginning of the only life that is actually yours. Not the life organized around the question, not the life built from the need to prove the construction. The life lived from the observer position. The life in which your effort is clean, your seeing is clear, your presence is full, and your reality is organized around what you actually are, rather than what the constructed self has been trying to become. Here's what this means going forward. The practice is not complicated, but it requires the one thing the constructed self is most reluctant to give: willingness to look, willingness to be the observer rather than the observed, willingness to watch the story instead of being it, willingness to meet the question instead of answering it, willingness to be present with the reality of what is, without the filter, without the story, without the need for it to mean something about whether you are enough. This willingness is not passive, it is the most active thing you can do. It requires more courage than any action taken from inside the story. Because action taken from inside the story has the protection of the story, it has the narrative of the self that is trying and striving and building and proving. The observer has none of that protection. The observer is naked, present, here, without the story to explain why it's here or what it means that it's here or whether being here is enough. And that nakedness, that presence without protection, is the most powerful state available to a human consciousness. Because from that state, from the observer position, your seeing is not distorted by the need to see something particular. Your decisions are not contaminated by the need to prove something. Your effort is not weighted by the question. Your presence in the world is not mediated by the construction. You are simply here, watching, aware. And reality, the quantum field of all possible realities, responds to that clarity the way it responds to every act of observation. It collapses into form. It becomes actual. It becomes real in the specific way that is most aligned with the awareness that is observing it. This is not magic. This is not the law of attraction dressed up in physics language. This is the logical consequence of what quantum mechanics tells us about the relationship between observation and reality, applied to the most fundamental act of observation available to a human being: the observation of the observer itself. The awareness recognizing itself as awareness. The watcher knowing itself as the watcher. And from that knowing, meeting reality with the clarity that creates rather than the confusion that accumulates. Pause here. One more time. This is the deepest observation. Right now, in this moment, before any story about what this means or what you should do with it, before any plan for how to apply this or any worry about whether you'll be able to maintain it, before the constructed self reasserts its authority and begins organizing this recognition into something it can use to answer the question. Before all of that, notice that you are here. Notice that the awareness is present. Notice that the watching is happening. Notice that you are, in this moment, the observer, not trying to be, not working toward being, already being. The observer is not something you achieve. It is what you are when you stop being absorbed in what you're observing. And you are, in this moment, less absorbed than you were when you started. Something has shifted, not because you've done something, because you've seen something, and what has been seen cannot be unseen. The constructed self will reassert itself. It always does. That is its nature. That is what it does. And that is fine. Because now you know what it is. You know it is content. You know it is the observed, not the observer. And every time it reasserts itself, every time the story starts running again, every time the question begins gathering evidence again, you have the capacity, the direct experiential capacity, not the theoretical capacity, but the actual lived, recognized capacity to watch it, to be the observer of it rather than the thing being observed. To return to the position that has always been yours, the position of the watcher, the witness, the pure awareness that you actually are. This is the practice. This is the life, not a destination, a continuous returning, a continuous choosing, a continuous recognition. The observer recognizing itself as the observer, awareness. Knowing itself as awareness. The watcher watching the watcher and finding in that watching not another object to observe, but the space itself, the awareness itself, the undeniable, unlocatable, unquestionable presence that has been here through everything, that has watched everything, that has never been diminished by anything, that has always been and is now and will always be the most fundamental truth of what you are. If there is someone in your life who has been carrying the weight of a story they've never been able to see past, consider sending them this, not as advice, as an act of courage on their behalf, because sometimes the clearest gift you can give another person is the permission to look at what they've been avoiding. When you share this with someone who needs it, something happens that goes beyond recommendation. Your having looked creates a field that makes it easier for them to look. The clarity of one observer amplifies the clarity available to another. That is not sentiment. That is the quantum mechanics of entanglement applied to human consciousness. What you have seen, shared with someone ready to see it, does not just inform them, it expands the field of observation itself. And if you want to return to this in a moment when the noise of the day has settled, when you feel yourself reacting instead of watching, this is the kind of transmission that lands differently in stillness than it does in motion. Now watch what happens in the comments below. Something is going to happen when you close this video and return to your ordinary life. The constructed self is going to try to convert what just happened into content, into a story about the person who watched a video and had a recognition, into evidence for or against the question, into something that can be added to the wall. This is what the constructed self does. This is its nature, and you don't need to fight it. But if you're willing, before you let it do that, before you let the recognition become a story about the recognition, do something. Write one thing in the comments below. Not a summary of what you learned, not a description of the concept. One thing you saw when you looked. One specific thing that you have been pretending wasn't there. One stone in the wall that you can now see as a stone rather than as yourself. Not because sharing it will prove something, not because the community needs your insight, because naming what you saw in the clear light of the observer is an act of observation. And acts of observation, as we have established, are not passive, they are events. They are the moment the wave function collapses. They are the moment possibility becomes actuality. They are the moment the thing you've been avoiding looking at becomes finally something you have looked at directly. And something you have looked at directly has lost its power to organize your reality from behind the curtain. Type, "I see it now," and it can't unsee itself, or drop one word, the word that names what you saw when you finally looked. Not the story, the thing, the one word that the observer sees clearly now that the constructed self was working so hard to keep in the shadows. And if this transmission gave you something, if something shifted, if the recognition landed in a way that feels real rather than theoretical, share it. Not as a recommendation, as an act of courage, because giving someone else the opportunity to look is one of the most powerful things you can do with what you've seen. The field of observers whose collective clarity amplifies the seeing for everyone. That field grows every time one person who has looked gives another person the courage to look. Here is the integration principle, the one thing to carry forward from everything that has been said here. You are not the constructed self, you are the observer, the awareness in which the constructed self appears. The watching in which the story arises and passes, the presence that has been here through every version of the self you've ever been. And the moment you return to that position, not as a concept, but as a lived recognition, the moment you choose to be the observer rather than the observed, reality has no choice but to respond. Not to your wanting, not to your effort, to your clarity, to the quality of your observation, to the presence of the awareness that you actually are, meeting what is actually here without the filter of the question. This is the most powerful thing you can do, not because it is dramatic, because it is real, because it is the actual mechanics of how consciousness and reality interact, because it is what quantum mechanics has been pointing at since the first physicist stood in front of the double-slit experiment and had to admit that the observer is not separate from what is being observed, that the act of looking changes what is seen. That reality is not a fixed structure waiting to be navigated correctly, but a probability field that collapses into specific form in the presence of clear observation. You are the clear observation. You are the observer. You are the presence that reality responds to, not the constructed self that has been trying to prove itself worthy of the response. The observer. The awareness, the watching that has been here all along. And now you see it. You were never meant to look away from this. You were never meant to stay absorbed in the content of the construction, defending the story, gathering evidence for the question, carrying the weight of what the constructed self couldn't metabolize. You were meant to be the observer. You have always been the observer. The forgetting was the journey. The recognition is the return. And here's what no one tells you about the return. It is not a single moment. It is not a one-time awakening after which everything is permanently resolved. It is a practice, a continuous, daily, moment-to-moment practice of returning to the observer position, of choosing again and again to watch the story rather than be it, to meet the question rather than answer it, to be present with reality rather than with the filter of the construction, to be the observer rather than the observed. And every time you return, every time you make that choice, every time you recognize the watcher and choose to be the watcher rather than what is being watched, the return becomes easier. The recognition becomes faster. The time spent absorbed in the construction becomes shorter, not because the construction disappears, because you become more fluent in the language of the observer, more practiced in the return, more at home in the space that is prior to the story. Until one day, not as a destination, but as a natural deepening, the observer is the default. The watching is the ground. The story runs, as it always will, but you are no longer it. You are the awareness in which it runs. And from that awareness, from that ground, from that observer position, your life moves differently, not because you forced it to, not because you've manifested it into a different shape, because the quality of your observation has changed, and what you observe at the quantum level, you change. The observer is the most powerful position in the universe, not because it controls, because it sees, and clarity is the only force that transforms without resistance. Because it doesn't fight what it's transforming, it simply sees it. And what is seen clearly, what is met directly by the observer without the filter of the construction, cannot maintain the authority of the unseen. It collapses from possibility into actuality. It becomes real in the specific way that is most aligned with the awareness that is observing it. You are the observer. You have always been the observer. The universe has been watching you realize it. And now you see. What has been seen cannot be unseen. What you are cannot be unfound. The observer cannot forget itself permanently. It can be absorbed. It can be distracted. It can lose itself in the content of its own experience. But it cannot not be. It cannot be other than what it is. And what it is, what you are, is the awareness in which all of this appears, the watching in which all of this arises and passes, the presence that has been here through everything. That is here now. That will be here always. You were never meant to look away, and now, finally, you haven't. The observer is not you. The observer is what you actually are. And everything else, every story, every construction, every version of the self you've been defending and improving and trying to prove is what the observer has been watching, patiently, completely, without judgment, without turning away, waiting for this moment, the moment you look back. Welcome to the observer position. You've been here all along, now stay. The next layer of this work is already waiting for you. Once you stop reacting and start watching, your entire timeline shifts permanently. That video will show you precisely what changes in the quantum field the moment you hold the observer position long enough for reality to reorganize around it. Watch it now.